Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise to take up a point that I debated in this place when we first had the news from the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change in the spring of this year, that we had less time than we thought we had in responding to the urgency of the science, that if we didn't reduce our emissions rapidly, we would lose any chance of holding to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, and we had to stay below 2 degrees. At that point, I quoted the United Nations Secretary General in my question to the government members. The Secretary General of the United Nations, António Guterres, had recently said of the promises made in Paris at COP21 in 2015 versus the delivery on climate action by governments around the world, he said, some governments are promising to reduce emissions, but emissions are increasing. He said, put simply, quote, they are lying, unquote. And I asked the honorable government members if they thought that when the UN Secretary General was speaking of governments that were doing one thing and saying the other, who did our government think António Guterres was referencing? Since the time of my question, it's been clear that additional support has come from this government to the expansion of fossil fuel development. And now we have a very clear difference here, and I want to set out the problem because I want to be fair to all concerned. The government of the current Liberal minority, supported by the NDP in their Competence Supply Agreement, appears to believe, or at least wants Canadians to believe, that net zero by 2050 is a target that will ensure we can hold our increase in global average temperature to less than 1.5 degrees, or at least as far below 2 degrees as possible. They put forward this notion, they emphasized it again in the Climate Accountability Act that was passed in the last Parliament, even though it's not true. It's not true that achieving net zero by 2050 assures us of a livable world. In fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Science, as delivered in the 6th Assessment Report, makes it very clear that the 2050 target of net zero is irrelevant. I've got to underscore that word. It's irrelevant if emissions continue to rise in the near term. In other words, a 2050 target without, and this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, emissions must peak globally and begin to fall dramatically at the latest before 2025, or any hope of 1.5 or 2 is gone. Now, a 2 degree Celsius world, Mr. Speaker, is unthinkable, and yet we're on track to it. Again, quoting António Guterres, the United Nations, when COP27 opened just earlier this month in Sharm el-Sheikh, and he said, the world is on a highway to climate hell, foot on the accelerator. So again, when we ask, what governments does this Canadian government believe the UN is referencing when they say some governments are promising and doing the opposite? Put simply, they are lying. And to whom does this government think it applies to say, foot on the accelerator, when we have a government that is insisting on building pipelines, expanding production, and drilling off Newfoundland? Whom is the United Nations referencing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my my honourable friend and colleague for the question. Mr. Speaker, I can't speak for the Secretary General nor speculate about which leaders he is referring to. However, what appears to be underlying his statement is a deep concern with the state of global emissions, despite several decades of international cooperation and political commitments. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, I share this deep concern, and so does our government. With less than a decade left to 2030, And with countries around the world quickly moving to a cleaner economy, Canada's 2030 target of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels is ambitious, necessary, and achievable, reflecting both the scale of the climate crisis and economic opportunity that climate action presents. This target reflects Canada's highest possible ambition in light of its current national circumstances. Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan is a roadmap that goes sector by sector and outlines the measures and strategies for Canada to reach this target and lays the foundations for achieving net zero emissions by 2050. This plan includes $9.1 billion in new investments and a suite of new measures to help mobilize Canada towards a truly sustainable economy and a leading competitor in the global transition to cleaner industries and technologies. This plan builds on the strong foundation set by the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change and the Strengthened Climate Plan. Since 2015, the government has delivered $100 billion in investments for climate action. These efforts are working, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to the actions of millions of Canadians, we have been able to halt our once upward trend of emissions and bend it downward. This roadmap will build on this progress and chart the course to lowering emissions by 40% below 2005 levels. Of course, ambitious action by Canada is alone not enough. Climate change is a global crisis that requires global solutions. Under the Paris Agreement, all have adopted national emissions targets. Like Canada, many have recently come forward with even stronger commitments. Still, there is much more to be done at the global level, and Canada will continue to play a key role and strongly advocate that all countries, particularly members of the G20, do their part to achieve 1.5 degrees temperature goal. We need more countries, Mr. Speaker, to adopt stronger targets and formal commitments to achieve net zero emissions. We need to see greater public and private investment in low carbon solutions. We need to see an even more deliberate and rapid move away from unabated coal. And as we move forward in driving down Canada's own emissions, we will continue to engage with international partners from all over the world and advocate for increased ambition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Speaker, the exchange I've just had with my friend and colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary, exactly explains our problem. Canada's targets are currently out of sync with what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we must do. Spending billions of dollars on good programs is excellent, but while this government gives with one hand, it takes with the other. So climate action absolutely promote heat pumps, absolutely promote electric cars is a drop in the bucket, while bucketfuls of effort continue to go that increase our production of oil and gas that goes to other countries where burned there puts us on the highway to climate hell. Our foot in this country is on the accelerator. If I do nothing before I die, then get this Prime Minister to get his heavy foot off the accelerator. I will die happy.
The honourable member